Hey there. So I'm about a half of the way done with the book Never Finished by David Goggins. This is his second book. If you read the book Can't Hurt Me, this is a totally great follow up to that book with some new and extra added ideas and some actionable things that you can put into your life right away. And on top of that, I wanted to share my favorite takeaway from this book so far. And it's what I believe to be the secret to your life improvement, to self improvement, if your life's been too easy. And you might be thinking, well, if life is great, if life is easy, isn't that awesome? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's not so awesome for some people. Sometimes you need limitations within your life so that you can start to find focus, to set yourself on a path in a certain direction. And that is one of the biggest takeaways that I've taken from the first half of this book. And, before I really dive into that, of what the takeaway really is, I wanted to go into, I had this interview, a podcast interview with a buddy of mine, Dylan Ruse. He's a coach. He has a practice called Prince to King, where he coaches young men and teenagers from age 14 or 13 to about 23 or 24 on the topic of masculinity and whatever the young man or teenager wants to ultimately achieve as a man or a boy or whatever. So he works with parents to work with their kids, with things like getting out of the house, things like having a purpose, very interesting things that, that aren't really talked about today in society when it comes to manhood or masculinity and those types of topics. We talk about sex, growing up, relationships, dating, but there's a topic that's not really approached upon in today's society. And there was a really interesting question that he asked me. He said, how did you know when you became a man? And I thought that was really interesting because there were moments in my life, this was my answer to him, was there were some moments in my life that I felt that were considered manly. There were definitely things that I did in my life that, I realized, hey, this is a point where I'm an adult. I'm a man. I need to be able to start doing these types of things, like moving out of the house, getting a different type of job, getting getting into certain types of relationships. And there was milestones like, having your first beer. But was there ever a moment in my life where, I did something, which he talks about a rite of passage, not David Goggins, but my buddy Dylan Ruse, the coach. He's talking about rites of passage. And from my perspective, there's things like the military, which, I'm not a veteran or anything, but, some people have that. And after the military, people say, hey, well, now you are ultimately a soldier, right? And in the Jewish religion, in Judaism, you have a bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah that tells you you're a man. And there are many cultures around the world in very tribal places where you have a rite of passage, something like sticking your hand, and I saw this on National Geographic or Discovery, where it's like sticking your hand in fire ant, and I don't recommend doing this, like some of the deadliest fire ants, and have them like bite your hands for like an hour, right? I don't recommend doing this, but these are some of the rites of passage that Dylan was somewhat talking about. And after that, you have this big celebration ceremony that says that, hey, you're a man. But, for me personally, I didn't have those events. I had to, at some point, just make a decision like, hey, I'm a man, right? So with that said, some interesting topics that I've really been hearing about in these past few weeks on the subject of masculinity, manhood, all of these things that are not being talked about on social media today. And with that said, this brought up an interesting idea that I learned from David Goggins, this book Never Finished, is what if you've had an easy life? When it comes to, success and everything. We think of David Goggins, his book, he goes over how he had a hard life. I mean, abused as a kid, grew up in a racist neighborhood, became one of the hardest badasses on the planet. What was it that helped him become those things? And we often hear about athletes that grew up without advantages, that grew up in tougher neighborhoods, that grew up in these environments where there was just, they didn't have the best resources. Athletes who, had to use like fake gloves to learn how to play baseball. And somehow they became the top athletes in the world, where there are neighborhoods where kids had these huge advantages, yet they don't go on to become, very successful athletes. Now, is that, cause and effect and all of that? I'm not sure. But what can you do? Do you have to grow up in a tough neighborhood? Do you have to grow up around, abuse and all of these terrible things? And I think David Goggins has the answer. What happens if you had an easy life? What happens if you have great parents? What happens if you grow up around money and great situations and nice neighborhoods? I mean, what happens? I mean, are you doomed for failure or whatever? No, I think he's got a great answer for that, and that answer is discipline. That idea of how to live a more successful life, how to improve your own life, and it's put simply as discipline. And there's another great book out there by Jocko Willink. He's another former, I mean, I don't know if you're supposed to call them former Navy SEALs, like once a Navy SEAL, always a Navy SEAL. I'm not sure. But ultimately, discipline is the answer. How can you become or improve your life if you've got an easy life, if everything's been cushy, if you've never had to worry about putting food on the table, if you've never had to worry about fighting or, some complicated dealing with like parents or whatever that are constantly, in battle or whatever. Like, and I'm not talking about like combat in the military. I'm talking about just like, physically and mentally challenging families where you just want to avoid the situation, avoid tough conversation. Like if you've had a great life, if you've grown up around money and you've never had to make tough decisions, or you've just like, you've had to worry about money, but you've had parents that really care and that just love you or whatever, how can you improve your life if you feel stuck? Because if you've had an easy life, things can become a challenge once you enter the real world, once you start to have certain challenges come your way, once you have to make super big decisions, once you have to start to have challenging relationships and make huge financial decisions, and that becomes really challenging because you've had an easy life, what can you do? And how can you improve your life when those situations hit? You don't have to go homeless. You don't have to pretend to be homeless for a little bit. You don't have to live out of a vehicle. You don't have to put yourself in a bad situation just to experience it, to know what it's like. You just need some discipline. And that's really what I took away from Never Finished. If you're 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, and you've come to a realization where you're not where you want to be, and you really want to take your life further, where you want to, take yourself and challenge yourself and push yourself to experience things that are going to improve you, whether it be a fitness challenge, whether it be going back to school, whether it be going to improve the work that you do at your job so that you can find a new house, get into new relationships, have more confidence in your life. What are those things that are going to help you get that? And again, you don't have to create a false situation in your life that creates false challenges and put yourself in maybe a bad situation, or anything like that. It's the answer to that, the secret that I believe that you can take away from this book, Never Finished, which is absolutely amazing, is David Goggins' stories tied around just having self-discipline. And in this situation, yes, he built self-discipline, but he did need a mentor, his grandfather, who helped him find discipline in his own life. So, that was an absolutely amazing takeaway for me, because I live in Los Angeles and I meet a lot of different people, and I work in film and television, and there are some of these conversations that happen out here with like, oh, well, this person was born into the film and television business, or this person, is born, a lot of people here live in great neighborhoods, are very wealthy, and, there's a lot of criticism in that area about people that are like born rich or whatever. And, it got me thinking, right? So if you have an easy life, how can you live better? And again, I'm not evaluating or setting the standard of what's a good life. That's for anyone to discover for themselves. But this idea of, if you want self-improvement, and you can have anything in the world, then how do you start to live better? How can you truly live a purpose in all of these things? How can you create an environment for yourself that's productive, but not necessarily putting yourself into a worse situation? You don't need to get into, alcohol and reach the lowest point of your life. You don't need to like let yourself go and reach the lowest point of your life to squander your physical health and all that just to say, oh, well, I came out of it and, I did all this. Ultimately, the answer that, I took away from this, as well as Jocko Willink's book, Discipline Equals Freedom, is this topic of discipline. And you can toughen yourself. Just because you grew up in an easy neighborhood, it doesn't mean you can't have a tougher personality and all of that. So with that said, all these different things coming together, I think this is an amazing book for anyone to read. And just seeing this concept of, there are people that are born or have had an easy life. You don't necessarily need to be born rich or whatever. But this idea that if things have not been challenging, if you want to challenge yourself, if you want to take yourself further beyond where you are, or maybe you've had an easy life and things are starting to get tough, things are starting to become challenging, things are starting to hit. Maybe certain relatives pass away who have, really helped you to cope with certain things. And from those things, you really had somebody to always go to. And because of that, there was comfort. But now that maybe they're no longer around, what do you do? How do you really take your life to another level, or really find a balance, find an equilibrium? I think those answers are in a book like this, Never Finished, or Jocko Willink's Discipline Equals Freedom. Some amazing stories here and lessons on discipline. And I don't mean like discipline like, preaching to the choir, like you need discipline in your life. Self-discipline is the answer, all of those things, not getting too preachy, but, one of the secrets to self-improvement, that is definitely it. The answer is in the reading here through some of the great stories that he shared. And again, Jocko Willink's book, Discipline Equals Freedom, the answer is right on the cover. With that said, thank you for watching this video. Hope you check out those two books. And I only reviewed this one right now because this was top of mind since it's fairly new. And he does a great job. There's also an audible version that's worth reading. The audible version also includes like voice podcasting. I mean, obviously audible is voice, right? It's a voice recorded listen. But on top of that, there's also a podcast like interview with David Goggins where you actually get to hear him talk about some of these situations and review it and really go over. And on top of that, you get a lot from hearing that voice in your head and that experience. So with that said, check out these books, and I hope that this video is helpful to you. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.